So, let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? You know, as the age of technology advances in our modern world, it also affects the empowerment of social media, and especially here on YouTube. But if there is one type of content that might not be safe, are the content made for kids, specifically weird animation videos, letters, numbers, kid games, and toy unboxing videos. But a majority of them are known as clickbait videos, especially with colorful thumbnails, titles, and the views the video gets. Those types of videos are not good and not safe for children watching these, especially if they're uneducational. Now for myself, when I was a kid, and YouTube was a new website that not a lot of people took to, I was a person who did watch a lot of television, especially during the time when I was watching blogs on Nick Jr., Playhouse Disney, Discovery Kids, and for me, PBS Kids. Every time I came home from school, I'd usually watch the last shows that were on the blog before it just goes to PBS. Even during the summer, I watched the blog throughout the entire day, with the exceptions of the early mornings. And every Saturday morning, I watched Thomas and Friends when it was on the air. Now with this build-up, you would think I'm saying that the kids' content on YouTube is not good. But I wouldn't say it. It would be him. Now yeah, he wasn't alive when YouTube didn't exist yet and the age of technology and social media wasn't a thing. But this man knows how to teach children's education the right way. During the late 1960s through the new millennium, and you know who I'm talking about, Mr. Rogers. I mean, for the people around my age and older, every American knows Mr. Rogers, one of the greatest national treasures of American television. Thanks to his PBS show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I really don't have any explanation here, because the show itself explains everything. So much so that this November there will be a biopic film called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, which is going to be directed by Maria Heller, who did Can You Ever Forgive Me, and stars Matthew Rhys and Tom Hanks as Fred Rogers, which I'm still somewhat questioning because he doesn't look like Mr. Rogers. Now, where have I seen that before, where he plays an iconic person but doesn't look or sounds like him? Now, for my views on Mr. Rogers, I was alive when the show was nearing its end in 2001, since I was born on the new millennium. And yes, that means I was born on January 1st, 2000. Well, back then, I regret not paying attention to the show because for some unknown reason, it wasn't really my cup of milk when it was on. But I do have more of appreciation to him as I got older, mainly through his history and how an inspiration he has to so many people, even other kids' shows that we grew up with. And yes, I know Sesame Street also has that inspiration as well. But with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it's all about one man in his one show. And last year marked the show's 50th anniversary. And in honor for that, there was a theatrical motion picture documentary directed by Morgan Neville, who did the Oscar-winning documentary 20 Feet from Stardom. I'm talking about Won't You Be My Neighbor, and the biggest snub of this past year's Oscars for Best Documentary Feature. Now, before I begin my thoughts on the film, I just want to say that this is the third time I've seen this film. The first time I watched it when it was released digitally, the second time was after its big Oscar snub, and the third time to do this review. Now, this film talks about the life and legacy of Mr. Rogers' career on television. Now, for those who haven't seen this documentary, this film goes into a lot of detail how he got into television through a little kid's blog called The Children's Corner with Josie Carey, featuring an introduction of the little hand puppet named Daniel Tiger. Then, in the late 60s, came the show we all know as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And what he does on his show, He talks about a lot of serious subjects and questions that might get some kids scared, but with his kind and gentle talk to the kids, he answers their questions and concerns from his stories in the land of make-believe. Throughout the entire series, he talked about a lot of serious subjects. There's one where he talks about war, there's one on assassinations, there's also racial segregation, death, mistakes, emotions like being angry, and so many more. And with the characters of the land of make-believe, the puppets are based on his life, mainly Daniel Tiger for a large majority, and King Friday the 13th during the last years of the show. With all these light stuff in his life, don't forget, there's also some dark moments in the film they talk about, mainly through Fred's life during the show. When the PBS funding was failing, he went to the U.S. Capitol to speak to Senator John Pastore in Congress of his support to the station. There was a time when the show went on a hiatus to make a failed spin-off show that he wanted to make for adults, but when the events of kids being injured after they saw the 1970s Superman film that stars Christopher Reeve, he had to bring the show back. There's a fellow cast member who is openly gay, and Fred said if you are, you can't work anymore. And then he later accepts it. The parodies that he's not really a fan of, with the exception of the SNL skit from Eddie Murphy, because they did had a photo together, and when violent television shows during the 80s and 90s, he felt angry about these shows that are not suitable for them. Even after the show's ending, when there were so many theories that were going around, and a protest during his memorial service. What this documentary did was in the way that really touches you. And you listen to these people who worked with Mr. Rogers, and some stories you would not expect on what they did. The one thing that really surprised me is when Mr. Rogers did a lot in the show, that was a technique he did when he was talking to children, is through silence. And you can just tell based on the silence that it's around where what I'm doing right now, especially the sound of the clock you hear in the background. And of course, there was a historic moments in the show's history, most notably the episode that featured Jeffrey Erlinger. What Morgan Neville did with this film was heartwarming, because you really see what he believed in him. Even the interviews with the cast of Fred's widow and his kids were very emotional. I could explain all day about this, but the movie will explain it for you. Not to mention there's even some animation used featured Daniel Tiger who would fit in Mr. Rogers' character, which kind of reminds me of the animation bits used in the documentary Life Animated, mainly because of its style, but it did work well. Now with all that said, there's only one issue I have with it, and it's rather short. Since the film is only an hour and a half, I would have loved to see more of his backstory when he was a child, to his relationship with his wife Joan, and other people who have been or even worked on the show like Michael Keaton. And yes, that Michael Keaton if you don't know the show's history. But with all that said, this has to be one of the best documentaries I've seen, especially as an emotional one to say the least. This needs to be watched by everybody, with the exceptions of kids under the age, because the film is rated PG-13. Now before I end this off, I just want to say to the young adults who are watching this review, or even those who watch the show, please tell your kids about Mr. Rogers, and maybe even show episodes that are on YouTube. Because with today's content that children are watching, some programs still go with that format, but a lot of shows are more imaginative and rather learning, with the exceptions of some shows like Sesame Street, Arthur, and other shows that I really don't know about. I know they think it might be boring to watch, but I'm telling you, with today's ages of support versus hate, nowadays, ever since Donald Trump was sworn in to be our president of our country, has been very divisive. I'm almost afraid there would be another civil war to ourselves through the media, and the kids who would be concerned on what's going on in our country now. So I beg you, please tell your kids about Mr. Rogers. as a lot of people who grew up with him saying that we need Mr. Rogers now. And it would be amazing if the public broadcasting station re-airs the show because on what's going on right now. And yes, I know there is the animated spin-off show Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, but apparently no one talks about it for some unknown reason. That's why we need Mr. Rogers nowadays. I would not be surprised if Mr. Rogers is not happy about half of our country being so hateful to the other half today. Even though he's no longer with us, we still like him a lot on what he has done during his life. Mr. Rogers, as a fellow PA native myself, 143, which means I love you and thank you for being my neighbor. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine?